Vertical erosion patterns up to 8 feet deep scar the limestone enclosure of the Great Sphinx. Erosion that could only be created by centuries of heavy rainfall. The last time Egypt experienced this kind of precipitation was 7,000 years ago, millennia before the first pyramid was even conceived. This isn't speculation. It's measurable geological evidence documented by Dr. Robert Schoch of Boston University. The Sphinx doesn't just suggest an earlier origin. Its very stones prove it existed thousands of years before conventional Egyptian civilization supposedly began. What we're looking at isn't just an ancient monument. It's physical proof of a lost chapter in human history that mainstream archaeology refuses to acknowledge. What we're taught in textbooks is that the Sphinx was carved around 2500 BCE by Pharaoh Khafre alongside his pyramid complex. This neat chronology keeps ancient Egypt's timeline intact and our understanding of civilization's development unchallenged. The entire foundation of Egyptian chronology depends on this timeline being correct. Museums worldwide display exhibits stating with absolute certainty that the Sphinx and pyramids were built within the same few centuries. Archaeological textbooks present this as established fact, not theory. Yet the physical evidence tells a radically different story, one written in stone through weathering patterns that simply cannot exist under the accepted timeline. These aren't subjective interpretations, but measurable geological formations that defy the conventional narrative. If you want more evidence-based investigations that challenge what we were taught, subscribe now. But before we accept this revolutionary claim, let's look at the evidence layer by layer. The most compelling scientific evidence comes from geology, not archaeology. Dr. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University with expertise in rock weathering patterns, first examined the Sphinx in 1990. What he discovered was extraordinary. The enclosure walls around the Sphinx display deep, undulating vertical fissures extending 6 to 8 feet downward. Distinct patterns that only form through prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall. Schoch determined that these erosion features required between 5,000 to 9,000 years to develop, dating the Sphinx to at least 7,000 BCE, and possibly as early as 9,000 BCE. The weathering profile is fundamentally different from typical wind and sand erosion seen on other structures at Giza. Wind erosion produces horizontal striations and pitting, while the Sphinx shows unmistakable vertical furrows consistent with water runoff. Dr. David Coxell, another geologist who studied the Sphinx, confirmed these findings, noting that the specific pattern of erosion, rounded edges and deep fissures, matches what we see in limestone structures exposed to prolonged periods of heavy precipitation. These patterns appear exclusively on the Sphinx and its enclosure, not on nearby Old Kingdom structures from the same era. A critical difference that mainstream Egyptology simply cannot explain. Further evidence comes from precipitation data. The last time Egypt experienced rainfall sufficient to cause such erosion was during the African humid period, ending around 3000 BCE, with truly substantial rainfall ending even earlier, around 5000 to 7000 BCE. The degree of weathering visible today would require centuries of heavy precipitation that simply didn't exist during or after Khafre's reign. Paleoclimatological studies of the region, using core samples from the Nile Delta and surrounding areas, demonstrate that Egypt transformed from savanna to desert between 7,000 and 3,000 BCE, with the most dramatic drying occurring before 4000 BCE. The deeply weathered limestone of the Sphinx body and enclosure could only have been exposed to the elements during this wetter period, placing its construction firmly before conventional Egyptian civilization supposedly began. But physical evidence is just the beginning. ancient Egyptian texts themselves challenge the conventional dating. The Inventory Stela, discovered at Giza in the 19th century, describes how Pharaoh Khufu, Khafre's father, found the Sphinx already buried in sand and ordered it to be restored, meaning the monument predated his dynasty. While Egyptologists dismiss this stela as a later fabrication from the 26th dynasty, this dismissal appears increasingly arbitrary, given that the stela's account aligns perfectly with the geological evidence. The text specifically mentions that Khufu gave to her offerings, and he built her temple, referring to the Sphinx as an already ancient monument associated with Isis and Osiris. This written record, though controversial, provides textual support for what the geology already tells us. Other historical records are equally revealing. Pliny the Elder's Natural History mentions Egyptian documents that describe the Sphinx as a royal tomb from the night of time, a phrase denoting extreme antiquity even to the ancient Egyptians themselves. The pharaoh Thutmose IV recorded on his dream stela how he found the Sphinx buried up to its neck in sand around 1400 BCE, indicating it was already ancient and had undergone centuries of neglect and restoration cycles. The stela describes the Sphinx speaking to Thutmose as Horemakhet, or Horus in the horizon, a solar deity of great antiquity in Egyptian tradition. The very fact that the Sphinx required major restoration so early in Egyptian history suggests a much older origin than conventionally accepted. Hieroglyphic inscriptions found in the Valley Temple adjacent to the Sphinx contain archaic writing forms that Egyptologists have difficulty translating. Forms that appear more primitive and predate standard hieroglyphic writing. Dr. Robert Bovall has pointed out that these inscriptions use symbology and astronomical references that align with much earlier periods of Egyptian prehistory, further supporting an earlier dating for the Sphinx complex. Egyptian astronomical knowledge provides even more compelling evidence. The Sphinx, carved as a lion's body with a human head, faces precisely due east, perfectly aligned with the rising sun at the spring equinox. During the epoch around 10,500 BCE, this alignment would have corresponded with the constellation Leo rising before the sun on the spring equinox, creating a celestial mirror image, the lion in the sky above, the lion on earth below. This as above, so below principle was fundamental to ancient Egyptian cosmology and appears repeatedly in their temple architecture and religious texts. This date of 10,500 BCE emerges repeatedly when analyzing precession data. The 25,920-year cycle, in which Earth's axis traces a complete circle among the stars. Using NASA's astronomical data, researchers have confirmed that Regulus, the brightest star in Leo, called the Heart of the Lion, would have aligned perfectly with the Sphinx's gaze during this period. The angle of the Sphinx's gaze, 14 degrees south of due east, precisely matches the rising point of Regulus during this epoch. This astronomical relationship cannot be coincidental, especially since the Sphinx is the only major monument at Giza with a leonine form. The Egyptian reverence for astronomical precision is well documented. They oriented their temples and monuments to stellar alignments with accuracy measured in arc minutes, making it highly unlikely that the Sphinx-Leo connection is random chance. Mathematical relationships between the Sphinx and other ancient structures further support this early date. The proportions and positioning of the Sphinx within the larger Giza complex reflect sophisticated geometrical knowledge, with the Sphinx serving as a geodetic marker in a global system of precisely positioned ancient monuments. When measured using the ancient Egyptian royal cubit, 20.62 inches, the Sphinx displays mathematical proportions that connect it to the dimensions of Earth itself, a system of measurement that appears in other megalithic sites worldwide. These mathematical relationships suggest the Sphinx was not an isolated monument, but part of a precisely planned global system. I've analyzed 3 more ancient sites with similar evidence. Subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation. The implications of an older Sphinx are profound. If correct, it means an advanced civilization existed in Egypt at least 7,000 years before the first pharaoh. A culture capable of quarrying and carving the largest monolithic statue on Earth. This civilization would have flourished during the transition from the last ice age, only to disappear as climate change transformed North Africa from lush savanna to desert. The technical skills required would have included precise astronomical knowledge, advanced mathematics, sophisticated stone-cutting techniques, and social organization capable of mobilizing a massive workforce. All supposedly thousands of years before writing, agriculture, and metallurgy became widespread. This evidence forces us to reconsider humanity's technological capabilities during periods we've dismissed as primitive. It suggests our timeline of human civilization is fundamentally flawed, with sophisticated societies rising and falling long before our historical record begins. The technical achievement of carving the Sphinx, which involves removing 200,000 tons of limestone, would have required advanced knowledge of engineering, mathematics, and astronomy that supposedly didn't exist until thousands of years later. If the Sphinx predates dynastic Egypt, where did this knowledge come from? And why is there such resistance to acknowledging the possibility of advanced prehistoric civilizations? Mainstream archaeologists have offered several counter-arguments to the water erosion hypothesis, but each fails under scrutiny. The most common objection claims the erosion resulted from subsurface groundwater seepage, not rainfall. However, Dr. Colin Reeder, a British geologist who initially set out to disprove Schoch's findings, ended up partially supporting them after his own analysis. Reeder demonstrated that groundwater could not produce the specific pattern of weathering visible on the Sphinx enclosure. Groundwater weathering creates distinctive honeycomb patterns and salt efflorescence completely absent from the Sphinx. Furthermore, if groundwater were responsible, all structures at the same elevation on the Giza Plateau would show identical weathering. But they don't. Only the Sphinx and its enclosure display these distinctive water erosion patterns. Another objection suggests occasional flash floods during the Old Kingdom could have caused the erosion. Yet flash floods would have produced dramatically different erosion patterns, sharper, more chaotic cuts rather than the smooth, undulating features actually present. Additionally, if flash floods were responsible, we would see identical weathering on other Old Kingdom monuments at Giza, but we don't. The erosion pattern on the Sphinx enclosure shows the characteristic rounded edges that develop from persistent rainfall over centuries, not from occasional flooding events. Hydrologists who have studied the site confirm that the drainage patterns around the Sphinx are consistent with prolonged rainfall, not sporadic flooding. Egyptologists also argue that the absence of other massive monuments from this early period makes the ancient Sphinx impossible. This circular reasoning assumes we found everything that once existed. The reality is that a civilization facing climate catastrophe as the Sahara dried would have left few traces, with most evidence buried under meters of sand or destroyed by subsequent cultures. Recent discoveries using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have revealed thousands of previously unknown structures across Egypt and neighboring regions. suggesting much of the archaeological record remains undiscovered. The Sphinx itself was buried up to its neck for most of its history, only being fully excavated in modern times. How many other monuments remain hidden beneath the sand? Most tellingly, no direct archaeological evidence links the Sphinx to Khafre. The so-called Khafre connection relies entirely on circumstantial evidence. The Sphinx's proximity to Khafre's pyramid and a disputed resemblance between the Sphinx's face and Khafre's statues. No inscription on the Sphinx itself names Khafre as its creator. Unusual for Egyptian monuments where pharaohs prominently displayed their achievements. In fact, when comparing the facial proportions of the Sphinx to known statues of Khafre, significant differences emerge in the cheekbone structure, eye spacing, and jawline. Dr. Mark Lehner, initially a proponent of the Khafre attribution, has admitted that direct evidence connecting Khafre to the Sphinx remains elusive. The restoration history of the Sphinx further supports an earlier origin. Archaeological evidence shows at least 3 major restoration projects throughout Egyptian history. Under Thutmose IV, 1400 BCE, during the 26th dynasty, 600 BCE, and in the Roman period. Each restoration addressed severe weathering damage that would have required thousands of years to develop. The earliest restoration, under Thutmose IV, involved adding stone blocks to the deteriorated body, blocks that themselves now show substantial weathering, indicating the original structure must be significantly older to have required such extensive repairs so early in Egyptian history. The Sphinx's anomalous age doesn't exist in isolation. Similar evidence of sophisticated ancient construction appears worldwide. At Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, massive stone structures dating to 9600 BCE display. Advanced architectural knowledge previously thought impossible for hunter-gatherers. The site's main pillars, weighing up to 16 tons each, are arranged in precise astronomical alignments that track the precession of the equinoxes. Knowledge supposedly not discovered until thousands of years later. The megalithic platforms at Baalbek contain the largest quarried stones in the world, with engineering features that remain difficult to explain. The famous Stone of the South weighs an estimated 1,000 tons, heavier than any crane today could lift. Yet it was quarried, transported, and precisely positioned with millimeter accuracy. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, precisely cut stone blocks show machining accuracy we struggle to replicate even today. With perfect right angles and complex interlocking surfaces that would require advanced tooling to create. Together, these sites form a pattern suggesting a widespread, advanced prehistoric culture, or cultures, with capabilities that force us to rewrite our understanding of human history. The evidence is being ignored by mainstream archaeology, locked into paradigms that cannot accommodate such early sophistication. The implications threaten established theories about the linear development of human civilization, which may explain the institutional resistance to these findings despite their basis in hard geological evidence. Subscribe for evidence-based investigations into ancient mysteries that mainstream science won't touch. Next week, I'll reveal the mathematical impossibilities of Göbekli Tepe that prove advanced knowledge of astronomy existed 12,000 years ago. What other ancient sites should I investigate? Drop your suggestions below.